Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, everyone, wherever you're watching this. Thank you, Carrie. It's so good to be back here. Thank you. Remember, every Tuesday, Village on the Isle at 10 o'clock for Isaiah. And just because you miss a lecture, no worries. We'll always pick up and work with whatever's coming next. And I will always have the text available to send to you. So I would like to direct you in the future, if you want to watch a session which you couldn't attend, to Our Savior website. We have a Facebook page and a YouTube channel, and every week I will tape right after the presentation. I'll make sure the tape is on the channel so you'll be able to follow along. And of course, I invite you to join us anytime you can make it to Village on the Isle. I need to know what you're getting out of this program. So please email me or text me. My email is 4donna4@gmail.com. That's the number 4, donna4@gmail.com. And I'm very curious about what you all thought of the very first chapter of the book of Isaiah. Why did you want to know more about Isaiah? What do you like about him? What do you want to study in more depth? Now, many believe Isaiah is actually of royal blood. And according to some rabbinic traditions, Isaiah is the son of Amoz, and Amoz was the brother of King Amaziah, who was the father of Uzziah, hence the royal blood. Now, does everyone know what pseudepigraphical is? Pseudepigraphical, I love that word. Well, these are works that are falsely attributed to an author, or when the true author sort of falsely attributes the work to someone else. And one of these works is called Martyrdom of Isaiah. And according to this work, Isaiah died a martyr's death under King Manasseh. Apparently, Isaiah was sawed in half. And you can read all about it in Hebrews 11. And there's a whole list of all the really bad things that can happen to prophets. Of course, no one knows if this is true. What we do know is a little bit about Isaiah's love life. And let me tell you, he was married, probably to a prophetess, someone in the know, and they had at least 2 sons, and they both chose really bad names for their son. Their oldest son was named Shir Jashub, and the second Maher Shamal Hashbaz. Now the firstborn son's name means a remnant shall remain, and the second son's name means quickly to the spoils, plunders speedily. So you see what I mean, not good names. And we'll talk about these 2 boys later on. We also know from last week that the book is divided into different sections that deal with different times. And today we're dealing with chapter 2. And today, as well as 3, 4, and 5, may all be out of this first period. So, a quick recap. After the death of Uzziah, during the reign of Jotham, around 746-43, so Jotham ruled for about 16 years, but this period includes a time when he was a co-regent with his father, who very sadly was suffering from leprosy, so he couldn't fulfill all his duties. So interesting, just like Dickens used to say, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. Good if you were well-to-do, great prosperity. Not so great if you were poor. Bitter poverty abounded. And there was so much social injustice. And we tend to think that we are the worst country in the world when it comes to social injustice. But we're not. I've heard it said that the poor are so much better off now than they have ever been the world over. So as we read the next 3 chapters, keep this in mind. And a quick reminder, if this is your first class, here's what we talked about last week. Mostly we reviewed the conditions of the Syro-Ephraimite War, or parts of chapter 1 could refer to Sennacherib's campaign in 701. And remember when Isaiah says in chapter 1, "Your country lies desolate, your cities are burned by fire, and aliens occupy your land." This is exactly what Sennacherib did to Judah when he invaded in 701. So last week, you'll remember we talked about the Syro-Ephraimite War, which you may remember was Syria and Ephraim against Judah. And remember, good old King Ahaz of Judah successfully turned to Assyria for help in fending off Israel and Syria. But the price was very steep. Judah became a vassal of Assyria. Assyria had to be paid regularly, big time. And that's what being a vassal means. So now, let's take a look at chapter 2. And it's an interesting chapter. Starts right off with a messianic prophecy. Now, to be fair, not everyone agrees with who the Messiah is. Maybe he's en route, but maybe he's been here and he'll be back. But I think after we get through with this chapter, you'll agree we are still waiting for the Messiah. Now, there are some scholars who say that this chapter, chapter 2, along with 3 and 4, were once a totally, completely separate book of Isaiah. And if you read ahead, I'm sure that you've noticed that this chapter sounds an awful lot like chapters 1 to 4 in the 4th chapter of Micah. Really, really similar. Here's Micah. "In the days to come, the mountain of the Lord will be established on the highest mountain. People will stream to it, people of many nations. And from here, the Lord's word will say, beat your swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks. No more war." So the question is Micah quoting from Isaiah, or is Isaiah quoting from Micah? Or are they both quoting from an earlier prophet? Or maybe God thinks that these verses are so important, God decides to have 2 of his best prophets saying the same thing twice. We don't seem to get the message, though, do we? But we really need to hear this message often. And it's interesting. So who said this first? There really is no scholarly consensus on this. Not a really strong one anyway. In any case, no matter who said it first, we should all agree. And we should all say it often. No more war. Of all the things we should be able to do, this is one of them. Stop making war on each other. That should be something we can do, but we don't get it. We just get better at doing it, right? We make bigger weapons to kill even more of us. And a few quick questions before we begin. Have you ever really thought about the city of Jerusalem? How many of you have ever visited Jerusalem? Have you ever considered Jerusalem as being the religious capital of the world? So what do you think? Is it or isn't it? Do you think that maybe Rome is the religious capital of the world? That's where the Pope is, right? Or how about Mecca? We know millions and millions of people visit Mecca each year for the Hajj. Or should there be a city of God in this kingdom here on earth? Should God's city be in heaven or paradise? Maybe having a city of God here in this kingdom, not such a great idea. Maybe that's just for when you die. You die and then you go to the capital, the city of God, where you used to worship when you were alive. Now, wouldn't that make the afterlife really, really tricky? Just think, there are tons and tons of holy places all over this planet. So once again, we wouldn't be together. We'd be separated. So what should we think? Well, listen carefully and try to hear what God is telling Isaiah to tell us. And of course, we have to hear what Isaiah is saying about Jerusalem. Before this city can be a capital of anything, it has to be cleaned up. Before it can be the capital, it has to be hosed down thoroughly because it's a pagan mess. So let's try to see what Isaiah is saying. And of course, we begin with a superscription, which is sort of a new heading. But we're not really sure if we should start with this, because this superscription may introduce chapter 2, or it may introduce 2, 3, or 4. We just don't know for sure. And a quick question. Are all of you very familiar with the prophet Micah? Have you spent a lot of time with Micah? We all love him, right? See how much you might recognize some of this in Isaiah from Micah. So let's take a look. And we should try to imagine this is a promise from God, not a pipe dream. And I think it's not just about judgment. I think the second chapter is more about hope. And I think it's really nice. And I am still hoping for this. These are the words, Isaiah's words about Judah and Jerusalem. But of course we know these are not Isaiah words. We know that God speaks through Isaiah. Isaiah's the prophet who speaks for God. So actually these are God's words. And some of the texts actually say this is what Isaiah saw. He didn't just hear the words, he saw them. And he still sees hope, the hope of God's promises. And don't you wish we could always see the hope of God's promises? Well, get ready, because something good is coming, and Isaiah can see it. And one definition of a prophet is someone who addresses the present tense in light of the future. Nice, right? But do you think that's such a good thing, living just for the future? What about actually staying where your feet are? Well, both are good, right? Here and now and then. So, what do you need to know now so that the future will always be bright? Well, it can be very tricky, right? So let's look at the text this morning. But before we do, are there any questions from last week? Be sure to email me or text me, and we'll spend some time talking about it. Now, I wonder sometimes if God has been way too easy on us. Have we really learned anything, or are we just hoping? Well, let's look. First thing Isaiah sees in his vision is a mountain. And we all know mountains are very big in Scripture. And this mountain that Isaiah describes will be the highest mountain ever, tallest one. And Isaiah calls it the mountain of the Lord's house. And we can all see that Isaiah is describing a place of worship, a special place, placed above all others. That's why it'll be so tall. It will be raised above all the hills that surround the area, and all the nations in the world shall stream to it. All the nations in the whole world. That's so nice. So it'll be like a pilgrimage place, and everyone will come to this mountain, this place, to learn Torah, the instructions of the Lord. Now maybe your text says, in the last days, instead of in the days to come. And maybe when you first read this text a long time ago, you were taught to see here the second coming of Jesus Christ. When you first learned this, did anyone here learn this? This is a vision for many of the second coming of Christ, which is the end time. And maybe some of you are feeling just a bit of deja vu. And maybe you've heard this before, and you would probably be right, because Micah said almost the exact same thing in chapter 4, 1 to 5. So there are some slight variations, but listen to Micah. The mountains of the Lord's house will be the tallest, raised up on the hills. Same thing, right? And people shall stream to it. And everyone will say, let's go to the mountain, and he will teach us his way, and we will walk in his way. And the message is the same. Micah and Isaiah, these two prophets, are giving us a hope for the future, so that we will be motivated to act now, so that we can begin to live a good, holy life now, so that our future will be holy. So let's hold off a little bit on the eschatological sense of the days to come. And do you know what I mean when I say eschatological? It means the last days. And you may know my eschatological joke, thanks to Ralph Jacobson, Lutheran pastor. He calls eschatology the study of the way things will get worse before they get better, when all reality ends. And he calls scholars who spend their whole career speculating about the end times, he calls them theological proctologists, because they're very interested in how everything will come out of the end of everything. And we could actually spend forever talking about the last days, the end times, the end of what is. But instead, let's talk about the days to come. And let's start with the temple in Jerusalem. Many people will come and say, let's go to the house of the Lord. That's the temple. And Isaiah calls it the house of Jacob here. Because remember, Jacob was also called Israel. And why will they come? Why will people come here to Jerusalem? So that God can teach us his ways, so we can walk on his paths. Now, verse 3, for out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And we can still read the same thing in Micah, and Isaiah continues, almost the same as Micah. And the Lord shall judge between nations, and the Lord shall arbitrate between many nations. And then here comes everybody's favorite part in Micah and in Isaiah. It's verse 4 in Isaiah. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. And nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they make war, not any more. Now, don't you just love that? Now, do any of you who have Bibles that say we need to replace the word temple with the word church? Now, does anybody see that written in their Bible? Well, we have done that though, haven't we? Which is in fact replacing Judaism with Christianity. Have you ever heard that before? Well, I have. Replacing Judaism with Christianity, replacing the temple with the church, and replacing the Old Testament God with Jesus. And this is what we call replacement theology. All we have to do is take out the word Judaism and replace it with Christianity. And isn't that exactly what Jesus did when he came? No, that is not what Jesus did. Do we not remember that Jesus was born a Jew, and he lived his entire life as a Jew, and Jesus died on the cross as a Jew? And do you know that it still surprises some kids in Sunday school to even mention the notion that Jesus was and still is a Jew? It absolutely stuns them. And I'm not talking about the little ones. I'm talking many of the older ones. They think that Jesus actually converted to Christianity while he was still alive. What have we done, Lord? Well, thank you, God, for Isaiah and Michael to help us out here. Micah. So we heard Micah and Isaiah sound almost the same. Out of Zion shall go forth instruction. So, say the rabbis, people will come here to Jerusalem to learn Torah, and not just to worship, rather to learn Torah. And not just to learn the words, but also to learn how to walk and how to talk and how to live like the Lord. And I've actually heard a few, more than a few Christians sort of scoff off the Torah from the pulpit. Seriously, you can hear them say, we don't need those laws, not anymore, because now we have the Gospels. They make it sound like they're Paul or something. And seriously, do we actually need the Big Ten? Don't we sort of argue about these today? The Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. Conservative Christians argue that the more liberal Christians, they just dismiss the Big Ten as sort of an outdated code of conduct. The world today is so much more complicated now. So where are you on a scale of 1 to 10? Do you think God is still taking them seriously? The 10 Commandments. Do you think God cares if you honor your parents or if you commit adultery? What do you think? Are we meant to be monogamous? We could be whatever we want, right? When we want what we want. That's the 21st century, right? But we have to keep hoping. And honestly, don't you just love what follows these verses? God has not abandoned us. God is still talking to us, even if we don't always listen. Isaiah tells us God will still judge between the nations. He will arbitrate. God will try to make peace. And of course, the very famous statements about making swords into plowshares and spurs into pruning hooks. No more war. Don't you think that sounds amazing? Universal disarmament. Or does that sound ridiculous? Like that's ever going to happen, right? The truth is, we are never going to make that happen. Only God can do it. Or do you think that's true? Do you think that's our job, or do you think that's God's job? But we can do some things. Some people say we can't create peace, but we can keep it. That's why everyone loves Isaiah. God and Isaiah, they sound so nice together. We won't make war. We'll learn Torah. The people will invite each other to come to Jerusalem. There are those who insist that the only way that we can stop making war in Jerusalem is to get the Jews out of Jerusalem. Now, how did that happen, right? Have we been listening closely this past year? Isaiah keeps seeing the words of the Lord, and now says Isaiah, "Come, house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." And that sounds so nice. And now comes the indictment. For you have forsaken the ways of your people, O house of Jacob. And that means Israel. Remember, Jacob is called Israel. And now the accusations come, and there are lots of them. Now the house of the Lord is filled with diviners, sort of those who can tell the future, like fortune tellers. And they come from the east, and they are like soothsayers, like the Philistines. We hate the Philistines. And we'll talk more about that later. But now remember, we're talking about the house of Israel. They clasp hands with foreigners. And Isaiah just keeps indicting the people of God. Their land is filled with silver and gold, and there's no end to their treasures. Check out verse 8. Their land is filled with horses and lots of chariots. And of course, these are very expensive things. And all the things mentioned here, silver and gold and horses and chariots, very, very expensive. How can they even afford this? But their land is also filled with idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to the work of their fingers. Now remember, the God is Israel, and the God of Israel is not depicted, never reproduced. There are no statues of God, no paintings, and there are no stelas. But idols, oh my goodness. There are so many images of idols, and they're all made by the hands of men and women. And there are little fat naked goddesses, and there are big strong men, and they're all made of clay or bronze or silver. And there are the calves, all kinds of cute little calves, all kinds of man-made objects to which the people of the land bow down to worship, or maybe to ask for favors. And this people has a covenant with God. And Isaiah reminds them, do not forgive them for this. This is an insult to the God of all. So don't ever forgive them. And that doesn't sound good, does it? So now, in verse 10, Isaiah says, hide, take cover, find shelter, like just climb in between all the rocks of the land and just hide way down there in the dust from the terror of the Lord and from the glory of his majesty. Just wait. The haughty eyes of the people will be brought low, and the pride of everyone will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted on that day. And don't think otherwise. The Lord shall reign supreme. No doubt about that. Now look at verse 12. The Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up high. This is a very typical theme in prophecy, the day of the Lord. And to be sure, it can mean different things to different people. But just so you know, the day of the Lord is coming, and it will be cruel, and it will be filled with fury and anger, and there will be cosmic upheaval, like the sun will shine at night and the moon during the day. And we read about it throughout the Bible. Mark talks about it along with Matthew and Luke and John. And it depends on who you are, but some believe that the God of the Israelites will visit Israel, and God will save the faithful and judge the people's enemies. Now, many believe the coming will be the return of Jesus, when he will judge the living and the dead. Sort of the goats and sheep story again. Or it could be the Father of Jesus who will judge. Now, Isaiah talks about the north of Israel on the day of the Lord. He says, against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted up, against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the mountains, all the hills, all the tallest towers, and all the fortified walls of every city, against all the ships of Tarshish, all of that will be humbled. So let's start at the top of Isaiah's list. The cedars of Lebanon. Lebanon is very famous for their cedars. And I checked. There are some cedars left in Lebanon. But sadly, so sadly, they've been way over-harvested. And even worse, war is so not healthy for trees. And as many of you may already know, Lebanon has been at war forever. And it still is. And Hezbollah in Lebanon is still bombing northern Israel. And why? Because Jews live there. And did you know that almost 30% of Lebanon is Christian? But sadly, the population of Christians in Lebanon is dwindling. The country is facing collapse. And some say it's being held captive by Hezbollah. Have you heard of Hezbollah? It's a Shia Islamist party whose enemy is Israel, and will not stop until the state of Israel is completely destroyed. And where do you think the swords are being made into bombs and missiles? And just so you know, the United States government is putting pressure on Israel to beat their swords into plowshares now in Lebanon. There will be no more cedars and no more Christians, but there'll still be lots of bombs and missiles. And how about the oaks of Bashan? Have you ever heard of Bashan? What about the bulls of Bashan, or King Og, right? All mentioned throughout the Bible. Well, today Bashan is located on the northeast side of the Jordan River, and it's still very well known for its heavily forested area, still known for its timber. But do we know about the people there? Do you know about the Druze? That's where many Druze live. Not Jewish, not Christian, not Muslim, but they are a monotheistic religion. And there's about 1 million Druze people who live in Bashan. And they lost this land when they attacked Israel in 1967 during the Six-Day War. The Druze live in religious freedom in Israel now, but we're not sure for how long. The U.S. government is pressuring Israel to give it back to Syria. Well, that's a question we need to ask, right? And how about Tarshish? Didn't we just talk about Tarshish when we read Jonah? And we think, it's probably somewhere in the western Mediterranean region, probably in Turkey today. And apparently when Isaiah is written, the port is filled with ships, and they're specially designed ships to carry ore, ports that will help rich people get even richer. And of course, we all know all those high, lofty places will pay homage to the Lord. And on that day, the day of the Lord, only the Lord will be exalted. Now look at verse 18. The idols will utterly pass away because they're polluted and diseased. So you better be sure to hide as carefully as you can. Enter the cave of the rocks and the holes of the ground. Get right down into there and try to hide from the terror of the Lord. Well, good luck, because people are hiding now in caves and just to stay alive. Just try to hide. But Isaiah is talking about hiding from God, not the U.S. government or the IDF or the Hezbollah missiles or Hamas tunnels. Isaiah is talking about hiding from the glory of his majesty when the day of the Lord comes and he rises to terrify the earth. And the second chapter poem ends with, "Turn away from mortals who have only breath in their nostrils. For what account are they?" Well, what did you think of that, right? Mortals have only breath in their nostrils. They won't last long. And gulp, that's us. We are all short-lived when it comes to comparison with the God of us all. We are just a blip on God's radar screen. So do you think that this poem is sort of a nice compromise between judgment and promise? We're being judged, but God promises to help us. Or do you think that these two can ever be combined? Now, some of you are going to get it, and the others will be promised a rescue. Do you think that's possible? And it all seems to function around Jerusalem. And where do you think Isaiah worked? In Jerusalem. And of course, the king lives in Jerusalem. But even more important, that's where the temple is. Jerusalem is the city of God, and God is holy, and so is Jerusalem. So it is holy. And it will be like a magnificent drawing card, like a giant magnet, drawing in everyone from all the cities of the world and all the nations of the world. So in fact, God promises peace and justice depending on who you are. If you are faithful, you are promised hope. And if you're not, you're judged. Now, can we see that today? Who is God helping out today? And what exactly is Isaiah doing here? Well, some say he's giving us a version of the kingdom of God right now, today. The kingdom is a mess. People are making war and they're worshiping idols, but not just little statues. They're worshiping things like money and prestige, and they are wasting their lives. But here, Isaiah gives us the vision that God has for his kingdom. And ready? Here it is. Jerusalem will be the most important place on earth. Now, does anyone still believe that? Maybe Jerusalem should not be part of any country. Jerusalem should just be an international city, not a giant magnet. And in terms of God reigning from Jerusalem, does anyone still believe that? Maybe God rules from a mosque or a church or a temple, which is not really there in Jerusalem because there is no temple anymore. There are a few walls still left, but mostly the temple is gone. And even if it is, no matter, because everyone will still want to come here because this is the city of God. Jerusalem is. Now, do you believe that? And because God rules from here, everyone will want to come to learn about the Lord. Isaiah is saying that God says, everyone will come here to learn Torah, to learn my ways, the ways to live together in peace and harmony. So Isaiah is saying that this is the vision of peace that God has asked me to see and to tell you all about. And we just heard one of the best known quotes ever about peace. Nation shall not make war against nation. And I think that most of us can truly get behind that statement. But what about the word of the Lord? When Isaiah tells us everyone in the entire world will come to Jerusalem at the Lord's request to learn Torah. Now, that verse is not as well known as swords and spears and to plowshares and pruning hooks. But Isaiah says those are the words God tells him to tell the world. These are the words that will be the instruments to feed the world. So how do you feel about the world learning the words of the Lord? How about Torah feeding the world? Now, the instructions from the Lord clearly say God is telling Isaiah to tell the world the Torah is for all people, for all the nations. This text is indeed inclusive. It's for everyone. So learn the words of God. Now, in our chapter today, God offers the entire world the Torah. And I was just at Jacaranda Trace, and hello everyone if you're watching from there. And we spoke about God's words, the Torah, the New Testament, the Quran, all believed by billions to be the word of the Lord. And they are all bound up in love. Love God and love each other. They're all the same. So God offers election to all. God says to all the children of the world, you are my children. Come and walk with me. Learn the way. Now, is that what you heard in chapter 2? Now, next week, we're going to read chapters 3 and 4 together. Very interesting chapters. So much has already gone wrong, and I can't imagine how anything can get worse. But this is Isaiah, so things always get worse. And this chapter just gets worse and worse. Very interesting comments about women. And I doubt that any of you here today will be able to see yourself among this group of women from Judah and Jerusalem. They're not a nice group. So see what you think. And Shavua Tov, have a wonderful week, and find yourself in chapters 3 and 4, and maybe just smell, just a whiff of what's to come. Thank you so much. And be sure to email me with your questions.